If anyone thinks that there's a contradiction between endorsing normalization and being pro-Palestinian and anti-Zionist, then they've never understood what normalization is. And they have not understood what normalization is, most likely because they're taking a very superficial, very emotional, and a very ideological approach to the Palestinian issue, and not a realistic, not an objective, and not a practical approach. In the view of these types of people, normalization means being pro-Israel, pro-Zionist, and anti-Palestinian. So normalization represents a betrayal in their mind, but not a betrayal of the Palestinians or of Palestine, but a betrayal of what they think is the sanctity of their ideological principle. And their ideological principle allows for only one approach to resolving the conflict, which is, of course, an absolutist approach. The only solution that they see is the expulsion of all Jews from Palestine by means of war. I mean, they want a Muslim army, ideally the unified militaries of the Muslim world, but alternatively, a citizen army of rank and file Muslims from far and near to march on Israel, to march on Jerusalem, to march on Tel Aviv and conquer it. That's the only outcome that they see as acceptable, and the only approach that they see as acceptable. Everything else is betrayal. And until this glorious victory comes, the Muslim world is supposed to shun and isolate Israel to express our collective disgust with the Zionist entity. They believe that this is our religious and moral obligation. Never mind that that adhering to this so-called religious and so-called moral obligation has resulted in over 70 years of increasingly worse conditions for the Palestinians and increasingly better conditions for Israel. And it has only seen Israel become stronger and more entrenched, and the Muslims and the Arabs become less and less formidable, less and less relevant. And the Palestinians have been reduced now. Because of this ideology, the Palestinians have been reduced to being just a political and a religious and an ideological football. Never mind that the Palestinians are the ones who have to pay with their blood and their children just to uphold your principled stance on your behalf. And it requires nothing of you whatsoever. Meanwhile, you're over there in the West paying your taxes, patronizing businesses, using products, so on and so on, and your money has been going to Israel all this time. So in other words, on a personal level, on an individual level, you personally have already normalized with Israel. You normalize with Israel every day. But because, boycotts are difficult to do, withholding your taxes is risky, it's dangerous, you could go to jail, contacting your politicians is ineffective, you don't feel that you can really have very much impact. You have all the excuses for your personal, individual normalization. You have all the excuses for why the only people who should be expected to have the courage and the conviction to uphold your moral and your religious obligation, so-called, is everyone else. And why the Palestinians themselves should be forever the sacred sacrifice to preserve your principles. Well, obviously, that's no kind of moral principle. That's contemptible. It's detached from reality. It's detached from realism or seriousness of any kind. The Palestinians, according to you, have to have no realistic option for improving their situation and their conditions in order for you to feel righteous. This is obviously deranged and delusional. In the real world, in realpolitik, anyone with any understanding of strategy, anyone with any understanding of geopolitics, anyone with any understanding of economics, with any understanding of the region, and anyone who understands the political power of investment will know that normalization is a gambit. Normalization is not capitulation. It's confrontation. It's strategic confrontation, whether you understand it or not. I mean, what you've had all these years was not confrontation. You might think so, or you might want to tell yourself it was, but it wasn't. It was self-neutralization. It was the Arab and the Muslim world choosing to have no leverage whatsoever, no influence, no relevance, no bargaining chips, and no access And during all that time, the Zionists could rationalize their need for America and for the West to bolster their security, to bolster their military, to bolster their intelligence, to protect them from all these hostile Arabs and Muslims who want to drive them into the sea. And they built up their economy. This is important. In isolation of the region. I mean, except for China and the United States, which are unavoidable anyway because they're the biggest economies in the world, all of the countries in the region, Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, they have mostly other countries in the region as their top trading partners. But for Israel, no. Israel has no serious economic ties to the other countries in the Middle East, not serious ones, not significant ones, which means that it is economically independent of those countries. And so their embargo of Israel has no impact whatsoever. It imposes no loss, and it gives them no bargaining power. It neutralizes them from having any relevance. I mean, everyone is always lambasting the Arab rulers for doing nothing, but you insist that they do nothing. They're not allowed to do anything by your standards except a military invasion. You insist on them having no other options, no other tools for doing anything other than, forming a military coalition and attacking Israel, which is the most asinine and adolescent thing that you could possibly propose. And it has been the most asinine and adolescent thing you could propose for the last 50 years. Normalization gives the Arab and Muslim countries more tools to work with. I mean, ask an Ethiopian or an Eritrean whether investment gives the Khalij political clout or not. Why, Gulf money ended 2 decades of conflict between those two countries, Eritrea and Ethiopia. When the coup happened in Egypt, and I remember, I was covering all of that. I was working on that. When Sisi came to power, he was set up to be nothing but a lapdog for the United States. But the UAE and Saudi Arabia pumped billions of dollars into Egypt. And they brought Egypt into their sphere of influence, which is most likely the only reason why you could see Sisi the other day lecturing Anthony Blinken on live television. Lebanon is not going to be able to have any president today. They're not going to be able to appoint or elect any president today that Saudi Arabia doesn't want. The UAE and Saudi Arabia have been buying influence even in Jordan recently, which is probably why King Abdullah II was also more or less defiant of the West when, Olaf Scholz was there the other day. The Khalij has expanded its sphere of influence to completely surround Israel, and normalization would allow them to swallow it. The UAE has already been in negotiations that would give Abu Dhabi 50% control, 50% stake in Israel's most important gas, the most important company in Israel's gas sector. They've been moving in to take over ports in Haifa and Eilat. The foreign minister of the UAE had himself photographed in Cyprus meeting with the head of the Israeli opposition a couple of months ago. They said that there were going to be consequences on Netanyahu if the Netanyahu government appointed extremists like Ben-Gvir. And Ben-Gvir got appointed. And well, how are things going for Netanyahu? Not just right now, but ever since they appointed Ben-Gvir, he's been having problems. Look, who initiated the Abraham Accords? It was Donald Trump. You can think whatever you want about Donald Trump, but one thing about him is clear and unique, and that is that he wanted to reduce America's foreign responsibilities, and he meant it, and he did it. He wanted America to withdraw from its international obligations, and the Abraham Accords was a part of that. You know, Trump didn't like sending billions of dollars overseas to anybody. He didn't like endlessly pumping money, American taxpayer money, into international projects that couldn't stand on their own. And Israel is just that sort of project. It's a money pit. It's the original money pit, long before Ukraine was a money pit. and has been for a very long time. The Abraham Accords, in my opinion, were intended to relieve America of the ongoing burden of propping up Israel and giving them a path through normalization to stand on their own by integrating into the region and shifting their dependence on the U.S. To more integrated economic ties with their neighbors and with the Gulf. That was the intention behind the Abraham Accords. It wasn't really about peace. It was about relieving America's burden of continuously and endlessly supporting Israel. Now, of course, radical extremists like Netanyahu, whose government relies on radical extremist voters, they don't like this because they know that it's a path that will lead to the end of Zionism. Because Zionism depends on being able to maintain the perception that Israel is under constant existential threat from its neighbors. And because Zionism could never have lasted this long without American life support. But regular Israelis are happy about it. They're happy about normalization, especially young Israelis. I mean, look at who visited who in greater numbers after the Abraham Accords. Did Emiratis visit Israel, or did Israelis visit Dubai? Something like 1 million Israelis flew to Dubai, and only 1,600 Emiratis visited Israel. Can't you see what that indicates? Bin Zayed is like the Pied Piper for the Israeli youth. I mean, why? If you polled Israeli young people and asked them if they want an Israel that's a theocratic Jewish state, the way that Netanyahu is pushing, or do they want the UAE to come over and turn Israel into another Dubai? What do you think they would want? What do you think they would prefer? What do you think they would choose? Go on, build a big tower, call it Burj Al Yahud. Why not? I'm telling you, young people in Israel need to be rescued from Zionism. They need to be rescued from extremism. They need to be rescued from the oppressive influence of religious extremism in that country. Like I said before, that means detaching themselves from the United States, because that's where all this is coming from. And I think that there are elements in the United States who genuinely do want that detachment to take place. Elements among the owners and controllers of global financialized capital. And those are elements that are affiliated to the Gulf, and they work with the Gulf. And they're interested in the Gulf Project and the Gulf vision for the region, because that vision is profitable, long-term. And it's an organizing vision for managing global South economies. Those are the people and the institutions of the OCGFC, the owners and controllers of global financialized capital, who are more global in nature, like I've said before, not Western-centric or less Western-centric. Those are the same elements that are pushing for the destabilization of Europe, which I've been talking about ever since the war began. These are the elements that are more interested in the pivot to the global South and to the East. Because like I've talked about at length, the Ukraine war and the sanctions against Russia have provided a huge boost to BRICS nations, to the global South, to Russia, to China, to the Gulf, and so on. And they've been accelerating the collapse of Europe. These are, factions within the finance sector, the energy sector, raw materials, mining, construction, agribusiness, and so on. So all of those same interests are interested in my opinion, they're interested in promoting normalization and promoting an end to Israel's codependent relationship with the United States. And they want the Middle East to become a congruent, conflict-free market. And yes, they recognize the very obvious reality that the Muslims are poised to be the single most important population in the world in the latter half of the 21st century. Because of course they are. These are the more far-sighted factions of the OCGFC. And there's friction and conflict between them and the more short-sighted Western-centric factions. But I think that the global factions are dominant. And I think that they will prevail in whatever conflict they have with the other factions. Because this is just the way that the world is going. And I mean, you see, in the current conflict, the BRICS are all in a row. Brazil, Russia, China, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, and even the official statement from the Foreign Ministry of India as anti-Muslim as India is, they're all saying the same thing. The root cause of the conflict is the dispossession of the Palestinians, and that has to be addressed. They're saying that the root cause is U.S. interference and the failure to ever implement the UN resolutions to call for a Palestinian state. They're all saying the same thing. And the implicit or sometimes explicit message is that the U.S. needs to be removed from this scenario. The message is identical. It's coordinated. It's clear. And it's being expressed by all the BRICS nations, by Egypt, by Jordan, by Qatar, and pretty much every Global South country. It's a coordinated response across all the Global South countries. A coordinated response to the war against Gaza. Now let me say something about Saudi Arabia, because it's connected to all this. Before the BRICS nations came out with their unified position regarding the Gaza conflict, this same position was actually expressed earlier by Saudi Arabia. I mean, before the Hamas attack and the current war, Mohammed bin Salman teased the idea of Saudi-Israeli normalization. He got Biden's hopes up. He got Israel's hopes up. He went on Fox News saying it was going to be the deal of the century if they could make it. He said it would be the deal of the century if they could make it. But he said if Biden could deliver the terms that were acceptable to Saudi Arabia. And then he dropped the hammer. The terms that Saudi Arabia demanded were essentially the same as what all the BRICS nations have said now in response to the conflict. In other words, implementation of a solution to the long-standing core issue, which is Palestinian statehood. Obviously, he knew perfectly well that this was not something that was ever going to be delivered by Biden or any American president, nor would it ever be agreed to by Netanyahu. So essentially what Mohammed bin Salman did was to say normalization cannot be American brokered, and it cannot be under Netanyahu. Both of these bad actors have to be removed from the field. They have to be taken away from the negotiating table. Now, bear in mind that Mohammed bin Salman and Donald Trump have a close relationship. And Saudi Arabia is plugged in to the global-oriented OCGFC, not least of all by the fact that the Aramco CEO now sits on the board of BlackRock. It looks to me like there's a tremendous amount of coordination taking place to not only remove the obstacle of Netanyahu, but a coordinated effort to force Israel to the negotiating table without its American sponsor. A negotiating table that will have Israel on one side and the entirety of the Global South on the other side. And the offer on the table is normalization with Saudi Arabia, which will mean a cascading series of agreements by other Muslim countries all around the world. And on the table is the promise of integration into the region, providing Israel more or less with a soft landing once its ties with the United States are finally severed. A soft landing comprised of billions of dollars of Gulf investment that could potentially eclipse what the Americans give Israel every year. Essentially, Israel will have a new paymaster. And this paymaster will ensure an end to the violence and conflict. The violence and conflict that their old paymaster insisted upon. It was the only reason that their old paymaster paid them at all, was in order to keep the conflict going, no matter how detrimental that might have been to their society. That was the condition for their old paymaster, the American paymaster. And now how does all of this relate to the one-state solution that I'm always talking about? Well, in my opinion, negotiations for a Palestinian state, for a two-state solution, will inevitably morph into negotiations for the one-state solution, because the two-state solution was only ever a recipe for conflict. It was never intended to be an actual outcome. The talks are probably going to, if and when they have the talks, they will stall over settlements, as they always do. And then the Global South mediators can propose the one-state solution. Now keep in mind, if this current war escalates, and it could very well escalate, That's only good for Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. That's only beneficial for them. The more damage that's done to the region, the Khalij will finance the reconstruction. They'll buy land, they'll redevelop the area, and that will only increase their political clout even more. And that includes Israel. You know, the more damage that this conflict does to Israel, to Israel's infrastructure, to their industry, to their economy, the better the bargaining position for Saudi Arabia, the better the bargaining position for the Gulf. The conflict only inflates the value of their investment or potential investment. And the more it incentivizes the Israeli people to pursue peace and stability and to abandon the destructive, archaic idea of Zionism. You know, the Saudis advised their citizens to leave Lebanon back in August. So that means that they were anticipating a large-scale conflict. Well, that's what it could mean. That's what it looks like. And it looks like they've been anticipating a conflict for months. I'm telling you, it looks like there's coordination. Not just Saudis, but the Saudis, the Russians, the Emiratis, and major players in the global south. Hamas never had this level of sophistication and capability before, and that's a fact. It's a coordinated effort to dislodge Israel from American interference and sponsorship, and to change the whole paradigm of the Middle East. And Allahu Alam. But I mean, if the conflict moves to Lebanon, it could very easily draw Iran into the conflict. And Iran is very hesitant to get involved. They like to issue statements every day about we're going to do this and we're going to do that, but they don't actually do anything. But if they get pulled into the conflict, well, who do you think that benefits except Saudi Arabia? That could take out their only regional rival for power in the region. Look, there's a massive rift in Israeli society. You know, the main people that are backing Netanyahu and the racist, you know, extremist, psychotic policies that his government supports, the only people who are supporting that are old people and ultra-Orthodox Jews. The ultra-Orthodox Jews who are free to be as radical and as delusional about Zionism as they want to be, because they don't have to do anything. They're exempt from military service. They don't pay taxes. They don't have to work. You know, they get housing for free. They can just sit around all day and read the Torah and have babies. So they don't have to pay and they don't have to participate in the violent enforcement of Zionist occupation. The ones who have to pay for it and the ones who have to enforce it by violence are the young, mostly secular Jews, liberal Jews, who don't even believe in it like that. Young secular Jews who just want to live normal lives. And I think that the one of the stumbling blocks, or one of the great fears among many of them, is that you know, why they can't give up the idea of Jewish supremacy, and they're holding on to Zionism, and they're afraid of a normal society that integrates the Palestinians. Their great fear is that the Palestinians, when they get the upper hand, that they'll punish them, that they'll take vengeance, you know, that they'll make them reap what they sowed for all these decades. It's just like the white South Africans at the closing years of apartheid. They prolonged apartheid precisely because they were afraid that they'd get strung up on every street light in Johannesburg if black people took over the government. But other than that, I don't really think that most Israelis, the young generation of Israelis anyway, are particularly interested in fighting for Zionism. They know it makes them look ridiculous, because it does make them look ridiculous. This is a ridiculous ideology to hold on to in the 21st century. It never made sense, and it makes even less sense now. The one-state solution is inevitable. The majority of Palestinians globally are in favor of a one-state solution. If you include all those who were in the diaspora, along with the Palestinians who live inside of Israel and the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, they're the majority, and they support a one-state solution. Even though a relatively small number of Jewish Israelis accept the one-state solution, that's only because it's been completely off the table all along. There's never been any serious discussion about a one-state solution, because they know that it means the end of Zionism. But every colonialist project ultimately will fail if they can't integrate into the land The only way that a colonialist project can succeed without integrating into the land is if they have an endless supply of immigrants. Well, Israel doesn't have that, and they never could have that, and they never will have that. A one-state solution, if it was implemented right now, the Palestinians were integrated into Israel. Israel would be a Palestinian majority country, and Palestinians have a higher birth rate than Jews on average, except for the ultra-Orthodox Jewish freeloaders. But their free ride may not last much longer. That may be over soon. And once their free ride is over, they'll either choose to leave and integrate at Israel because of their own religious fanaticism, or they'll just start having as many babies as they can actually provide for themselves without government subsidy. And Palestine will just return to what it always was, what it always has been, an Arab Muslim country with a flourishing Jewish minority. And what's wrong with that? Now, sure, the transition to a one state will be rocky. And the apartheid mentality of the Israelis will need time to correct. And the Palestinians in a one state will likely have to contend with discrimination and with prejudice, and attempts to exclude them from any sort of power sharing in the government. But this would be a civil rights struggle, not a struggle between life and death. There'd be no more blockade of Gaza. There'd be no more Bantustanization of the West Bank. No more airstrikes, no more killing, no more genocide. Palestinian rights would be pursued by means of legal and civil action, not armed action. And assuming that the one state would, the one state agreement, the one state solution would include full citizenship rights for the Palestinians, including voting rights, they would have the political power to obtain their rights. Normalization itself would lead to a cultural change in the country, and it would blunt the edge of the Jewish supremacist mentality, and the society could develop like any other society. There'd be minor frictions and tensions and so on, but there wouldn't be war. Now, there are some Muslim ideologues who say that this is impossible, that the Jews will never accept it, that they'll never get along with the Arabs and with the Muslims. But that's disproved by history. Muslims and Jews lived together for centuries like this. This worked for almost 400 years after the Muslims first came to Palestine and unbanished the Jews at that time. And it worked like that up until the Crusades, when the Jews had another problem. And then after the Crusaders were kicked out, it was almost 1,000 years that the Muslims and the Jews lived together until the Zionists came and ripped the society apart. So there's no doubt about the ability of Jews and Muslims to live together. We always did. I mean, you can just look at Jewish minorities in different Arab countries, like or Muslim countries, like look at Morocco or look at Turkey. The Jews are doing fine there. They're at peace with the Muslims. There's no conflict. The only thing that ever caused a significant problem between Muslims and Jews was Zionism. And those same Muslims who say that this won't work, despite it having worked for almost 10 times longer than it hasn't worked, those same Muslims will say that I'm naive for advocating a one-state solution, that I'm naive. But these are the same people who insist that Palestine can only be liberated by basically a resurrection of Salah ad-Din's army charging on Jerusalem from all sides. Meanwhile, those same people also say that all the Muslim rulers are corrupt puppets of the West, and that the Muslims themselves, the Muslim populations, are largely misguided and far from Islam, and so on and so on. All of that just makes their fantasy even more far from possibility. But somehow they can convince themselves that this absurd fantasy is more realistic than what I've outlined, and that to believe in a realistic and practical strategy instead of their delusional and useless imaginary solution constitutes a betrayal of the Palestinians, even though what I'm talking about provides real, tangible opportunities for improving the conditions for the Palestinians. And what they are advocating promises nothing but more of the same, and ever worsening conditions for the Palestinians, because that's all it ever has achieved, and that's all it ever could achieve. They are believing exactly what the Israelis and the Americans want them to believe. Their belief only serves the interests of Zionism, plain and simple, because it has no practical impact whatsoever, and it completely supports the rationale of existential threat that underpins Zionism itself. These are not people who understand strategy. They don't understand politics. They only want the Palestinians to keep bleeding so that they can hold on to their fantasies and to their own irrelevance. I'm telling you, the Middle East is being reshaped. It's being re-engineered right before our eyes, and that includes what's happening right now with this war. And this conflict, the current conflict, is not in contradiction with normalization. It's in conjunction with it. And I believe that the ultimate outcome, or anyway, the intended outcome, is the end of Zionism and the emergence of a one-state solution, which will exist, the one state within the soft empire being managed by the Gulf countries. And Allahu Alam.